Welcome to Commission Ed, the Air Force Officer Podcast. Here we explore the training and development of America's leaders in the application of air power and the profession of arms. The views expressed are those of the hosts and do not reflect the official policy or position of the United States Air Force, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government.
Welcome back to another episode of Commission Ed, the Air Force Officer Podcast. I am Colin Slade.
And I'm Reed Gann, and we're your hosts for Commission Ed.
All right, Reed. It's been a couple of weeks since we've recorded anything. Let's just do a little bit of catch up on how things are going. I'll start off. My wife had a baby.
Congratulations. We're super excited about that.
Thank you. It was an incredible experience, as the birth of any child is. The thing that we enjoyed the most out of this particular childbirth is that our son did not have to spend any time in the NICU, as was the case for our previous two children. So 2 days in the hospital, and then we got to bring him home. It was awesome.
That's really good. Did mom get some sleep while she was in the hospital?
I mean,
just a little bit. 'Cause she didn't have to deal with the other two, right?
Yeah.
That's one thing my wife was super excited about going to the hospital. She's like, no, I'm going to stay the whole 2-3 days. I have 2 more kids at home. I don't have to worry about them. Yeah. So
a little mini vacation of sorts, but not at all.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that mom and baby are healthy. We're super happy for you both.
Yeah. It's been such a great blessing. And on top of all of that, I get to grow my beard out during my paternity leave.
And it looks fantastic. I'll just let all the audience know it looks great.
Thank you. Well, Reed, what have you been up to the last few weeks?
Just getting back to it. So I got back from my, quote, deployment of sorts, right? My long-term TDY out to the UK. Took a bunch of time off, and now I'm just getting back into the swing of things. It's good to be back in the saddle.
Awesome. I mean, I know you're an intel guy, and you like to keep things a secret, but can you talk at all about what it is that you're doing now that you're back off your TDY?
Nope, just working. At a time and date in the future, we'll talk about it.
All right. Well, good. I'm glad that you're back at work and enjoying it, even though doing the super secret squirrel stuff is not something that you are able to share with the rest of us. But some day in the future, 25 years from now, when the whole thing becomes declass, we'll be happy to hear from you.
Yeah, it'll be great.
Well, good. All right. So we haven't done this yet. This episode has kind of been a long time coming. I mean, this is the Air Force Officer Podcast, and we do talk about being officers in the Air Force, and the general public most readily identifies Air Force officers with being a pilot. Yet we have never talked about the process of actually becoming one.
Yeah, it's about time, right? How many times have you been asked what aircraft do you fly?
Pretty much every time somebody asks me, hey, you're in the Army, right? And I'm like, nope, I'm actually in the Air Force. And they're like, oh, cool. What aircraft do you fly? And I say, I don't. And usually the conversation ends there because I'm no longer cool or worth talking to.
Yep, it's a pretty common question. I'm used to it by now.
Yeah. What I would like to tell them, and what we've discussed on the podcast before, is that really only about 4% of people in the Air Force are actually pilots, and that there are a bunch of other specialties and career fields that officers participate in. But that's not the topic for today. We are going to talk about how you become a pilot in the Air Force.
Yep. They are our frontline troops, if you will, right? This is our family business, and it's about time we gave the folks a little bit about how to.
Absolutely. So as is our wont, we will explain to everybody here that this process is outlined in AFI 36-2105 that explains the process for applying to flying training to be a air battle manager, as well as the astronaut programs.
Yep. I love the fact that being an astronaut is an actual job that is open to you in the U.S. Air Force. We actually just got a call last week. I don't know if you got that email, Colin.
Yeah, I did, actually.
It's a kind of an interesting email to get. I mean, where else, Colin, do you get an email saying, hey, do you want to be an astronaut? And they're actually dead serious. Anyway, I love our job.
I mean, obviously, there are some very stringent requirements, not only the degree, but everything else that goes along with it. And then it's going to be highly competitive. But yeah, that is part of our family business.
Did I tell you, Colin, that I got to do training for some astronauts that came to Maxwell?
Really?
I did. I actually did. Yeah, it was fantastic. So Project X, you know,
Okay.
Project X? Yeah. So it's kind of like a grown-up problem-solving playground. It's fantastic. I actually really enjoy it. Long story short, by some person who knew somebody, it turns out they were friends with some astronauts, and they were basically describing that they needed a way of team building and also evaluating leadership and communication. And they said, hey, well, we've got this whole place. You ought to come down. So they'd been coming down for 3 or 4 years at that point when I was given the opportunity to go train astronauts. And they are every bit as good as we think they are.
Please tell me they solved every single one of those obstacles.
No, they actually didn't solve any of them.
Oh, great.
So it really fascinating. Really quick, I'll just interject before we get back to this pilot stuff. But space is a zero fail in every step, whereas here on Earth, we can take more risk.
Yeah.
And you must decide and act in these scenarios if you're going to win, because you actually have to fail a couple times and go, oh, that's not going to work. They don't have that. They have to avoid that at all costs. So they are incredibly risk averse. And that was really fascinating for both them to see and observe and for us to watch. But I mean, radio discipline, their ability to communicate over radios is mind blowing.
Yeah.
It's incredible. But I guess that happens if you're, I don't know, in space and you can't see stuff, right? They're pretty good. Anyway, really incredible opportunity. One of the highlights of my career for sure. And they're every bit as good and deserving of all the fame and everything that goes with being an astronaut.
Can you get an astronaut on the show for us?
No. I can't. No. I mean, I basically took my picture with him and posted on Instagram. It was like, what an amazing day. But yeah, I don't know them. And they don't remember me, I'm sure.
Anybody out there in the audience, if you know an astronaut, ask them if they would be willing to do an interview, because that would be amazing. But anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about today.
Back to the show.
All right. So if you are interested in better understanding the process of applying to flying training, being an air battle manager, or the astronaut programs, you can look that up in AFI 362105. But that is not our purpose today. We want to give you some broad strokes, some things that you can use in your pursuit of becoming a pilot or other rated officer. Regardless of where you are in the process, we hope that this information will be useful to you.
Let's start off with a quick description of what we're talking about when we say rated. We've talked about line versus non-line. We've talked about rated versus non-rated. But let's just give a quick review of what we're talking about, Colin.
Absolutely. Rated officers are line officers that carry an aviation rating with the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA. So rated officers come in 4 categories within the Air Force. That is pilot, combat systems officer, air battle manager, and remotely piloted aircraft pilot.
Exactly.
Well, let's explain quickly for the audience what the difference is between each of those different rated officers, starting obviously with pilot. These are the aircraft operators, the drivers, if you will. These are the folks that are directly in control of operating the aircraft, making sure that it gets off the ground, flies safely, and then lands safely again.
Exactly. Yep. The next one is the Combat Systems Officer, or CISO. Now, we've got an interview that we've already conducted, and we'll have that for you in a few weeks. It's a really great interview. Looking forward to sharing that with you folks. They do a really good job of breaking down all of the differences, but there's also a few little subcategories, if you will. So you have a Weapons Systems Officer, you have an Electronic Warfare Officer, and some navigators. And those all kind of roll up under this general category of Combat Systems Officer.
Yeah, and I should say that as the podcast continues to progress, we're going to have lots of interviews from pilots in various different categories, different shred outs, flying lots of different types of aircraft. So don't expect that this is your one and only chance to hear about being a pilot or a CISO, an air battle manager, or an RPA. We are in the process and want to continue bringing those interviews, that type of information to you.
Along with that, if any of you fall into these categories and you would like to share your experience with the audience, hit us up on email, on Facebook or Instagram. We'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. So an air battle manager, or an ABM, is the officer that orchestrates the battle in the air. These officers are typically found on board the JSTARS or the AWACS, as well as various other airborne platforms, or even on the ground. Now, Reed, before we turned on the mics, you were explaining to me that there are various air battle managers that may actually not be rated, but fulfill an ABM type role, but on the ground.
Yeah. And the only way I know that is because I met and worked with one. So I know they went to air battle management school. They did almost identical training. They just didn't get a rated category out of that. I'm not entirely sure if those are only guard units. This was a guard member. I'm not sure if there are some active duty ground-based ABMers out there. It's possible. I just don't know. But I do know that there are some that are ground-centric. Last category are the RPA, remotely piloted aircraft, and these are pilots. When these aircraft are flown, especially the full motion video platforms like the Reaper, MQ-9, there are two people primarily operating the aircraft when it's in the air. You have a pilot and you have a sensor operator. The sensor operator is an enlisted position. Most of those are intelligence types that have some sort of imagery exploitation capability, right? They can see things in imagery and know what that is. And then the pilot is actually the pilot that is flying the aircraft. There's also some pilots who have to take off and land the aircraft closer to where the aircraft is actually operating. So the other aircraft that they're going to operate is the RQ-4 or the Global Hawk. And that's driven in a very different way. But bottom line, we have pilots who fly those aircraft. And, RPA is not going away. Air Force Association conference that was held in Florida within the last few weeks, Elon Musk said the age of manned aviation is over. Now, we all know that he's a futurist, but he's also not dumb, and he may not be wrong. So we'll save that debate for another time, but RPA, they're not going anywhere, and we need some folks to fly those things.
Yep, absolutely. And one thing that we want you to understand with regards to the process of becoming a pilot and opting into a rated categorization board, which we will explain. If you opt into one of those boards, if you are volunteering to become one of any of those rated officers, you are actually volunteering to become any one of them according to the needs of the Air Force.
Yep. It's good to know what you're signing up for. I think these are all pretty good jobs, but if you want to be only a pilot, know that you may not get that.
All right. With that information at hand, let's talk about the actual process of becoming a pilot or any rated officer for the Air Force.
So let's start off with the elephant in the room, Colin, and that's the Air Force Academy. We know that the most amount of pilots in the Air Force or rated officers in general, they come from the Air Force Academy. They get the first hack at fulfilling the need, the annual goals. And if you are young enough and haven't really started school and you want to be a pilot in the Air Force, go to the Academy. You're going to have the best chance to get a pilot slot out of there than you will ROTC or trying to go to OTS. The thing is, we don't know a lot about how it works. And frankly, it may not apply to most in the audience, so we didn't give it too much time.
Yeah. And one thing that we should mention that we haven't yet is that the number of each of these different rated categories, the number of pilots in the Air Force or that are brought into the Air Force each year, as well as the number of CISOs and ABMs and RPA pilots, is all governed by the PGL, the program guidance letter that dictates from Congress to the Air Force exactly how many of each of these different positions are available and will be funded by Congress.
And the PGL is filled and accomplished in priority order: Air Force Academy, ROTC, OTS is last. So just know that going in.
And also that the PGL changes every single year. So even though there was a huge number of pilots or other rated officers accepted in the last few years, that isn't necessarily going to be the case from here on out. The number of officers being brought into the Air Force just in general is starting to trend downward. And so the process and the chances of getting selected as a pilot or other rated officer in the Air Force is going to become even more competitive than it already is.
Yep, exactly. Hey, Colin, with that, why don't we turn the time over to you to go over the ROTC process?
Absolutely. So I mentioned in my deep dive into Air Force ROTC that the process of becoming a pilot or other rated officer starts actually before you go to field training. It is part of the POC selection process when you get your enrollment allocation that you can choose to be given a rated EA prior to going to field training. And what that means is that when you have finished field training and when you are 2 years away from graduating and receiving your commission, you will participate in the rated board. Now, what do I mean by the rated board? It's just like any other board that we've described on this podcast before. Your records will be collected together and submitted to a central selection board, a group of people at Maxwell or AFPC at Randolph or any other type of board, and they are going to make a decision about your paper records. You personally do not get to stand up in front of them and tell them about how you've wanted to be a pilot since you were a fetus. You will be represented by your paperwork, which means that you need to make sure that your records are up to date and accurate. So that process begins when you choose to get a rated EA. And then when you are 2 years out from graduating and receiving your commission, you will meet the rated categorization board or rated selection board that starts in the October or November of that year. For those that are doing a 4-year program, this happens when you are a 300. If you're going to be doing a 5th year, this rated categorization board will happen in your 400 year.
So, Colin, you said the board meets in November, December?
That is correct.
When are the results announced?
It's variable, but it's usually end of February, beginning of March. In fact, we are anticipating that those results will be coming out any day now.
Yeah, I've definitely seen the memes on Reddit. It seems like the 300s are pretty anxious at the moment.
Yes, they are. And the reason that the results being published is variable is because of the PGL, like we've described. At least this last year, AFPC has been working with Headquarters Air Force and the A1 staff there to update the PGL, and it's had some pretty significant impacts on all kinds of different sorts of boards and assignment selection and that kind of stuff. And it's been impacting OTS as well.
Yeah, the last selection rate for the last non-rated board was 2%.
That's insane.
Yeah, I thought my board was low at 10%, but 2% is unreal.
Yeah, and that's because the PGL is a moving target. It will continue to change and adapt as the Air Force tries to project its needs according to whatever is going on in the world and the fiscal environment here in the States.
Yeah. And if you think being an Intel guy is hard, try to predict the future on officer production numbers. I don't want that job.
Exactly. Yeah. So like I've said, the board will meet in November, and then results will usually be published end of February, beginning of March. And it is at that point that these cadets will be notified of their selection either for pilot or CISO, ABM, or RPA.
Quick question, Colin. And I know this is probably very detachment dependent. Is this information, does it flow to the detachment commander or does it actually flow to the member?
It flows to the commander.
Okay. Do you guys have some sort of like a drop night or like a big announcement party? And I'm sure, like I said, every detachment probably has their own tradition that goes along with that. But that sounds like that could be a pretty fun opportunity to, highlight some students and their success.
Yeah, I can't speak for other detachments, but I know we try to make it special. I mean, this is a big deal. Cadets have been chasing these positions for some of them, their entire lives. And so finding out that they've been selected as a pilot is something that we try to make very special for them.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds like a good time.
So now let's talk about the actual things that you have to provide or that is going to be seen by the rated selection board when you submit your documents. So the first thing that they're going to look at is going to be your objective records. So things like, what is your major? Is it technical or non-technical? What are your grades? What are your physical fitness scores? Your performance at field training? What are your scores on the AFOQT, the Air Force Officer Qualifying Test? Do you meet the age requirements? These are the things that are objectively assessed by the board. It just is what it is, right? Other things that are included as part of that is the TBAS, or the Test of Basic Aviation Skills, which is an assessment of your aptitude for aviation. How well you can control a joystick and yaw pedals. And then the other thing that comes into this is any number of flight hours that you have accrued through receiving personal instruction from a flight instructor, or maybe you already have your pilot's license and you fly regularly. So any number of hours is also taken into account and is part of the objective measures for your board score.
Yeah, that was something I wanted to make sure that we pointed out. One of my fellow flight mates was actually a multi-engine instructor pilot. So those types of ratings that you can get from the FAA will be part of that objective measurement.
Yep. So these things you may have some control over, like you have control over the degree that you choose, how well you succeed within your classes, and that will determine your GPA. There are some minimums that you need to be aware of. You do need to have at least a 2.5 cumulative GPA, and this includes any transfer credits as you've moved from one university to another. You do also need to graduate and receive your commission prior to your 33rd birthday. Now, this is an update to previous policy, and I think is something that is very welcome among those that are interested in pursuing rated selection. And then the last thing is that in order to be considered for the rated category that you are interested in, pilot, including RPA or CISO or Air Battle Manager, you must score at least a 25 in that respective section in the AFOQT. Now, if you want to be a CISO, for example, you do not have to score at least a 25 in the pilot or the ABM section. However, knowing that if you volunteer for one, you volunteer for all, and you want to give yourself the best possible chance at being selected for any possible rated category, you want to score as high as you possibly can, at least a 25 in each one of those sections.
And we should say these minimums are reasonably low. If you're serious about doing this and you've put in the time and energy, you should be able to meet these minimums reasonably well.
Yeah, and we'll have future episodes about how to best prepare and succeed on the AFOQT, on the TBAS, how to increase your PICSM, the pilot candidate selection method score. We aim to provide you as much information as we can on how to be successful in this process. All right, so that covers the things that you have control over, and that is where your focus should be. There are some things where you do not have any control over it, and that is specifically your medical. You may find that you're just not medically qualified to be a rated officer. And each of the different ratings has their own medical requirements, and we will link in the show notes towards websites that explain fully what each of those medical requirements are. And then the last one that you don't have direct control over, that also makes up the biggest portion of your board score, is the commander's ranking. Specifically, how you stack up against your peers there at the detachment. Now, we've talked about the commander's ranking before, especially in my deep dive into Air Force ROTC. There is no specific standardized way on how commanders will do the commander's ranking. Our purpose here today is not to tell you all the many ways that you can increase your commander's ranking. There are many ways that you can influence that, but your responsibility is to be the best that you possibly can in everything that you do that you have control over.
And that's a good introduction to the Air Force in general, right? Every single commander that you ever worked for is going to have a different way of doing business. So might as well start at the beginning.
Yep. So all of this information gets put together in its order of merit that adjusts year to year. Some years they'll give more weight to the AFOQT. Some other years they'll prefer GPA. The order of merit and the weighting on each of these different things is going to change from year to year. But the bottom line that you need to understand is that all of this information is put together, fed into the gonculator that then spits out a number that represents you. And that is what is seen by the board. And if there is, we'll say 500 slots for pilot that year, and they rank order everybody 1 through N, 1 through 500 will get pilot, and then 501 and down won't. Now, there's a little bit more nuance to that, but I just want you to understand that you are represented by your records and this number. The additional nuance that goes into that is that when you opt into the rated board, you get to put in your preference about what is your level of interest and priority for each of these different rated categorizations. So if your number one goal is to become a pilot, you will say to the board that you are highly interested in pilot. You can also say that you're highly interested in the rest of them, but you don't have to. You can say moderate interest or low interest in the others. And then in that rank ordered list, the 1 through 500 that I mentioned previously, the Air Force is going to award pilot first to those who are highly interested in being a pilot. And usually what will happen is, however number of pilot slots are available, there will be more people that are highly interested than what's available. And so usually everybody who gets pilot got it because they said that they were highly interested and their score was high enough so that they would be selected first. After they have filled all of the pilot slots, the board will then move to CISO, and they will rank order everybody 1 through N. Same thing. This is the number of spots that are available. We'll say 250, and they will first give it to those that are highly interested. Now, it's possible that there are more spots available for CISO than those who are highly interested. So then the board is going to have to go to those who are moderate or have a low interest in CISO. And that is how it is possible that you will get categorized into something that you don't necessarily have a high interest in. So then the board fills the CISOs with those that are highly interested or less than highly interested, and then they move to ABM. Same thing, 1 through N, highly interested first to fill up as many spots as they can, and if they can't fill them all, they'll go to those that are moderate or low interest, and same thing for RPA. Anything that I need to clarify on that, Reed?
No, I mean, I think it's important for folks to understand this whole board process, it's going to be the rest of their career.
Great.
So when we talk about OTS, again, want to caveat OTS instructors, right? That's my experience. OTS as an organization has nothing to do with selection. So take all of this with that caveat in mind. Now, the process for OTS and the requirements for getting a rated spot and going to OTS is very similar to the board process that Colin described. The PICSM is still used. TBAS is still used. The AFOQT is still used. All of those things just become part of your normal OTS application process. Now, for prior enlisted, they are going to follow the normal prior enlisted process, again, with the addition of TBAS and PICSM. They also may take a flight physical as part of the application. I've seen a couple different conflicting guidance documents on that, so I'm not entirely sure. But I do know that some enlisted members will also do a flight physical as part of their application. For civilians, your med flight stuff happens after selection. So if you are selected for a rated spot, you're going to do some additional medical before you show up at OTS. Now, for OTS, there are rated boards and non-rated boards. Generally, there are 2 rated boards per calendar year. And again, if you're applying for the rated board, you may be selected for any of the rated positions. Colin, you mentioned a new requirement. So as of 22 February, so this is a pretty recent change, the age moved. I believe it was you had to be trained and commissioned by your 30th birthday. They've moved that up to 33 without an exception to policy. So a real change there. That's one of the big requirements, but that's the same requirement whether you're, going to OTS or not. Same as what Colin described. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is for Air National Guard and Reserve applicants. They are hired by the units that they are going to work for. So case in point, there's a A-10 unit here in the Baltimore area. They are a National Guard unit, and if they need a pilot, they are going to hire in whatever way they deem necessary. And once they've selected their member, that member is going to get a slot from the Air National Guard for the number of slots that they've got reserved there at OTS. I don't know where the PICSM, TBAS, AFOQT falls in for that process because every unit does it differently. So simply can't speak to it. But bottom line, those people are hired by those units for those aircraft for that mission. Very different process, and it's going to be everyone's unique.
Yeah, I can speak to the reserve thing a little bit. I know that the reserve uses a central selection board process very similar to what we've described. The main difference is that once that individual has been selected as a rated officer, they have to then go get hired by a unit. So they've been selected for flying training or ABM or RPA, but they don't have a unit to go to unless they go and get one, which is unlike the active duty side where AFPC, the personnel center, is going to assign one to you, right?
Yeah, but the bottom line is you're not going to OTS unless a unit has hired you. And that's the key there. For our reserve component, that's a critical aspect. But other than that, the process is pretty similar. And again, I really want to emphasize this. OTS is used as the flexible partner in the commissioning scheme. They get the leftovers. I've had flights at OTS with 0 pilots in them. I've had flights at OTS with more than half RPA. It really just depends. They are the ones that are kind of getting, okay, we need some officers in this area. We'll hire them at OTS. That's how it works. So again, if your dream is to be a pilot, hopefully you've had a chance to go to the academy. If that didn't work out, maybe ROTC. And if the only option for you is OTS, be prepared to compete for some limited spots.
Now, the last thing that we should say on that is that once you are an officer in a non-rated or non-line position, you can still become a rated officer. Now, neither one of us is very expert on that process. We will do our best to bring in somebody who is, but we do know that the process is still fairly similar in that you are going to meet a central selection board so long as you are eligible because of those age requirements, as well as you have to have less than 8 years total federal commission service, or TFCS, to be eligible without an exception to policy.
Yep. And a lot of those requirements are outlined in the Air Force instruction that we already mentioned, 362105. I know personally a couple people that were already in the Air Force as an officer performing their duties and applied for the board and were selected for pilot. So it does happen. We're in charge of who gets in the club. And if there's a need, it can happen. But again, don't make that your primary plan, right? We need to emphasize that. Those are not very common, but they do happen.
And I just realized that I misspoke, that you can already be a rated officer. For example, you could be a CISO and then go get a pilot slot and become a pilot. That also does happen.
Yep. The guy I'm talking about, he was a line officer, non-rated operations. He was an intel guy and still liked intel, but there's a need for pilots and he thought, man, that seems like it'd be a pretty cool thing, and got picked up. So seems like a good option for some folks.
Yeah. So the idea here was to give you some basics on the process of becoming a pilot, but not solving every possible situation. If you have the goal of becoming a pilot or any other rated officer for the Air Force, we highly recommend that you reach out to a recruiter or to another pilot or a rated officer, or you can reach out to us and we will do our best to put you in contact with someone who can answer those questions for you.
Absolutely. And they'll be more than happy to answer your questions.
So we hope that this information has been useful to you. We hope that you will share it with someone that you know that is interested in being a pilot or in the jet in some form or fashion, so that they can start taking actions now to either go to the academy, join Air Force ROTC, or if they absolutely have to, apply for a rated board through OTS.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Commission Ed.
Thank you for listening to Commission Ed, the Air Force Officer Podcast. The views and opinions of the authors expressed herein do not state or reflect those of the U.S. government and shall not be used for advertising or product endorsement purposes. Mention of any specific commercial products, process, or service by trade name, trademark, manufacturer, or otherwise does not necessarily constitute nor imply its endorsement, recommendation, or favoring by the U.S. government. The mention of companies by name is solely for the purpose of discussion and should not be implied as endorsement.